We are now approaching a time in our world where the documentation and experiments that have been gathered over decades by organizations and individuals, such as our guest today, is being recognized as significant evidence that our reality is not the fundamental reality, but that consciousness is the fundamental reality. Evidence from the double-slit experiment revealed this to scientists 100 years ago, and shortly the experiments designed by Thomas Campbell, physicist, may provide even more dramatic evidence that consciousness is at the root of reality. It is a pleasure to present our guests, Wiewergen Zeefy and Thomas Campbell. Wiewergen and Tom have very different backgrounds. Wiewergen is a world-renowned artist and designer, and Tom is a nuclear physicist. One thing they have in common, though, is that they are both highly accomplished consciousness explorers. Wiewergen is the author of Multidimensional Man, a chronicle of 40 years of out-of-body experiences and consciousness exploration. Vistas of Infinity, his research on life after death, and The 10-Minute Moment, what happens when consciousness focuses on itself. In these books, Wiewergen has created a rich and vibrant, detailed map of his experiences in the larger reality. Tom Campbell is the author of My Big Toe, a big theory of everything that unifies all the phenomena that some refer to as paranormal, as well as the normal, while deriving physics and unifying quantum mechanics and relativity. His book began with consciousness and then led to these further discoveries. He also researched and gathered evidence in consciousness for over 40 years. Our guests are here today to share their ideas and discoveries in consciousness with you. I should mention one more thing that Wiewergen and Tom share. They both discovered meditation in the 1970s, and that was the key to exploring consciousness. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Wiewergen, can you tell us about your beginnings in consciousness and what your experiences have meant to you?
Well, the beginnings were quite dramatic in a way, because the reason I even started meditation was because I was suffering from depression. And it was a suggestion a friend of mine made. And so I attended transcendental meditation. And lo and behold, after 6 months, my depression had disappeared. And it is from then on that I became interested in the phenomena in meditation because of the beneficial aspect. I started reading books on it. I started studying the Eastern schools, the Eastern philosophy, and I got deeper and deeper drawn into meditation. I have to say at that time I was a total materialist. I only saw that consciousness or meditation was a function of the physical brain. It had nothing to do with anything supernatural. I thought anything like that was just simply superstition, any ghosts and things like that people reported. I just didn't believe in it. But I then started an intensive after I read a lot of books on the Indian sages and things, I became very curious, and I started to increase my meditation from about an hour every day to about 5 hours every day and in the evening. And after about 6 months, I had a really harrowing experience, which made me stop the whole lot, because I must have touched some really dark subconscious shadows of mine, which initially I tried to express in my paintings. But one night I heard a mighty bang coming from my studio, and I noticed a painting of mine which represented my shadows in the form of demons, had toppled off the easel, and an ashtray was catapulted across the floor. And the first thing was I was going to close the window, but nothing externally was there that needed to be addressed. And I also suddenly had this incredible fear, this coldness. And that was the first time I was confronted with something that I couldn't explain. So because the whole thing was such a mystery, I decided I've got into areas of my own consciousness which I better not go to, because from that moment on I thought this was an unknown territory and I didn't want to go any further. So after this event, I decided to stop meditation altogether and just return to my normal artistic sort of career. But then something has happened subconsciously, and about a few months later, I had a spontaneous awakening experience. And the way that happened was I was sitting in my studio having breakfast, which consisted of a large cheese sandwich and a cup of coffee. And I suddenly felt I was alienated from my hands. I couldn't figure out who these hands belonged to. And this thing gained an incredible intensity, and suddenly I found myself faced with the question, who am I? And at that moment, I lost all sense of ego self, all sense of identity, and I was suddenly standing in this incredible light in my room. And the only way I can describe it was that it was a feeling of as if something said to me, there you are, where have you been? Now, this whole thing sort of escalated more and more, and I got into a state of total ecstasy until I reached a point of singularity, I guess, where I was confronted with a pure state of being. And the interesting thing was, it had no attributes. It had no, it was just total clarity. There was nothing, the best thing I can say about it was a sort of supreme neutrality. There was nothing one could say about it. And this lasted, I don't know how long, perhaps half an hour. And then I gradually sort of returned back to the darkness of my daylit room and entered my own body again. And obviously I was totally overwhelmed by the experience. Another thing that happened after that for about 3 weeks, I was walking around in a state of non-identification. I didn't have a sense of self. Wherever I looked, I only encountered myself. There was this incredible space accompanied by an incredible peace. So, of course, this experience only lasted perhaps for 3 weeks. And then I gradually and fortunately I entered my own old ego identification. But of course that wasn't the end of it. It was as if my sense of self or my sense of reality had been shattered and had thrown open all sorts of possibilities. And one of the things that I think was a byproduct of this intensive experience was the fact that I had begun to have spontaneous out-of-body experiences. And they were just as confusing, just as bewildering. But then I found, after a few months, the first thing I heard about the phenomena was reading a book by Castaneda, which was called A Separate Reality. And then when I came to England, I came across a book which Tom obviously came across himself, the book by Robert Monroe, Journeys Out of the Body. And of course that changed everything. For the first time I had a kind of compass. I knew it was not some mental illness or anything. It was something that actually was part of our human potential. So basically, in a nutshell, that's it. After everything that followed, after that is sort of documented in both of my books, but it took until 2008 before I actually came out, because it's a sort of thing which you don't want to talk about to everybody, especially if you're a scientist, Tom, because people probably think you're nuts. The thing is, of course, because I'm an artist, I've got a little bit more leeway, because artists are crazy, so I was more at liberty to report about it. But I can totally understand that you're sort of holding back on reporting your personal experiences from this point of view.
Yes.
Tom, can you comment on what creates a spontaneous out-of-body experience? What is the significance of that? And also to comment on Robert Monroe's book, the first book, The Journeys Out of the Body, that brought a lot of people a lot of comfort, and they didn't feel like they were going crazy because they felt that this man's experiences now put into the mainstream this phenomenon that we now call out-of-body experience. Do you have any comments on what Jürgen has experienced and what the significance might be of these spontaneous out-of-body experiences, which Robert Monroe did have?
Yes. When people have spontaneous out-of-bodies, fundamentally that means they're ready. They are at a point where they are ready to expand their awareness in this way. And not everybody is ready to do that. If you're a very fearful person, then going out of body can be a very fearful experience. And fear is the problem. Getting rid of fear is a solution. So for someone to spontaneously go out of body and continue going out of body when they really would rather not, and it's a frightening or terrifying experience, that just makes it harder for them. They're going backwards because they're generating fear rather than letting go of fear. So I think spontaneously it happens for most people when they are ready to deal with it and when they are on a trajectory of expanding their sense and understanding of reality and what they are and who they are and why they are. If they're on that kind of a trajectory, then this just seems to happen when they get ready for it. But as you noticed as Jürgen spoke about his coming to the point where he is now, it's a progression of things. It didn't just happen to him all at once. He wasn't just out of body all the time. It started with the meditation. Same with me. It started with the meditation, and it's a process of becoming, a process of evolving. And there's step 1 and step 2 and step 3, and everybody has different steps. They get there in their own way, in their own time. And the connection with the larger consciousness system. Now that's my metaphor, but with all that is, let's put it that way, or with the source, that white light is how we often interpret it, where you are one with everything. You are a piece of everything, and everything's a piece of you, and you feel the love, you feel connected. And as he says, there's no cells of I'm here and it's there. It's all just one thing, the sense of oneness that you get. That is a kind of another step that you take in this process, where you realize that reality is not this physical place at all. Reality is a much bigger, broader, more wonderful, more fundamental, more basic thing, and it's connected to everything. It's not that we are all separate things doing our own thing and competing with each other. It's that we're really all part of a bigger thing. And that bigger thing is a beautiful, wonderful, loving, it's just, it's such a total, I don't know how to call it. I guess you could call it, it's, I don't know. It's just, you can't put it into words. It's one of those experiences that until you've had it, you just can't, you can't have the idea what it is. But people have this experience sometimes when they do, near-death experiences. Some of the NDEs, are brought to this same understanding, the same experience. And indeed, it's experience that you can pretty much have anytime you want, in the sense that you can get into that state, you can connect with the larger conscious system and just become one with it. It's not a special state that only happens once in your life or something. It's just it's a part of what you can experience as consciousness. And the first time you experience it, it changes your life. I don't know anybody who experiences something like that and just walks away and says, oh, well, just another experience. It's a life changer. And then when you experience it the second and the third and the 10th time, it's still as powerful as it was the first time. You never get an attitude of, oh, well, yeah, I've done that before. It's always just a totally unexplainable, totally consuming, and you are just part of it. And there is no stress. It's perfect peace. It's perfect tranquility. It's perfect knowing. There is no fear. There's no need. It's not that you need anything to be any particular way at all. Everything is just as it is supposed to be. And that's a terrific experience. But you get to these states generally when you're ready, or when the larger consciousness system thinks that this will be a very positive experience. It'll help start your growth or help propel your spiritual growth. And then, like in an NDE, that person may have not been on a path before, but afterwards, many of those end up on a path of seeking, understanding, and looking for a bigger picture rather than the small picture. So, yes, spontaneous stuff happens because we're ready for it. We can use it. We can grow from it. And that's why it's there. If we couldn't grow from it, I don't think it would happen. And all of those people who say, well, it never happened to me, well, I think mostly they're not on a trajectory, on a path, or in a space where that's going to be a step forward for them. That may be something frightening or terrifying and not be a positive step. And being ready comes from several places. Some of it, as we come here and are born here and start our life packets here, some of us are more ready than others just because we've been around and we've learned more. This is an evolutionary process, this spiritual growth. And in any evolutionary process, there's lots of, there's always improvement. There's always places to grow. There's always more to learn. There's always more to become. And we're all basically in the same boat of trying to do the best we can with what we've got. And some of us come in more ready. Some of us are still struggling, trying to get ready. But it's not that any are above or below others. We're all just the same, struggling with wherever it is we happen to be in this process. And we're not all the same place. We're different places. Some people learn it sooner. Some people learn it later. There's no, there should be no pride in your particular space in this evolution. It just is. It's where you are, and you still have challenges, and everybody else still has challenges, and we all have our challenges that are at the level of which we can handle. And there's some probability that we can actually take that challenge and turn it into something good.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful thing about it. When this awakening, let's call it an awakening experience happens, awakening to the reality of how things are, that is only the beginning, isn't it? Because from then on, you're only starting to get into the state where it's no longer an experience, but a state which when the greater consciousness system or which you have entered into dominates or flips over the identity, and suddenly you find you can no longer get out of it. It's almost like going back into the past, or the person you thought you were has gradually disappeared, and there's no way you can then see the reality in the same way as you did in the past. And I find this is a really important stage, which can, of course, take a lifetime, because there's so much stuff going on in our subconscious, which makes it quite a difficult process to weed out all the fear, as you mentioned, all the elements which are still dormant. But once this process has sort of been matured and you get into a state rather than an experience, then you start really unfolding your real potential. Then you have the freedom to branch out, to embrace totally new possibilities, because the fear element has gone from your life. I would even say you get into a state when you wake up in the morning. The first thing is that there is a sense of happiness. There's a sense of being, and the way I sometimes like to put it is that the bedrock of reality is actually bliss. If you strip everything away from reality or the fear, what you're left with is bliss. And that is a primary state on which the whole of evolution, the whole of reality is based upon. And that's what I like when you mentioned the only thing we can do is love, and be of service, because there's nothing else that is more important, and that's the thing. We then we act from a basis of being, which gives us greater freedom, more liberty, and a greater potential to become active and effective. So that's the way I sort of experience it.
Yeah, I agree. There was an old saying that a monk was describing what it is to be enlightened, and he said, before you're enlightened, you chop wood and carry water, and after you're enlightened, you chop wood and carry water. And that is true. It's not that the idea isn't that you end up in a state of bliss and just stay there in that state of bliss, with your legs crossed and a smile on your face and experience that oneness. The idea is that you take that understanding and incorporate it into your everyday life. It's not that you escape this world, but you come into this world and interact with it, because by your interaction, you will be challenged and you'll grow up, and so will you help everybody else that's in contact with you grow up.
Absolutely,
and that's the key. So, it's not, the bliss is just there in the sense that when you are done with, when you get rid of your fear, or even get rid of a lot of your fear, when you get rid of much of your fear, then your life just is happy. It's just a blissful life, because there isn't anything, sort of by definition, everything that happens, even the tough things, even the hard things, it's something that you look at as a challenge, as a way of making a better choice. And how does this affect other people? And what is the best way for me to deal with this tough challenge? So even the hard things, even the sad things, are challenges for you to grow and to learn from. And when you see everything as an opportunity, then it's hard to be anything other than in a positive mood about everything, because it's all opportunity. There's really no downside in that sense. So it's not that life treats you well and suddenly, your bank account fills up and suddenly, people are giving you things that you want. That's not it at all. Yeah. What you want is to make good choices. What you want, is to grow up and become love and get rid of that fear. And on that path, happiness is just a natural result of being whole, being love.
This is what I found so funny when, because what you just said, we're just starting, we are still growing, and there is no end to the growth process. So you mentioned on one of your videos the done people,
yes.
The people who think they get to a stage and they are done, and I thought that was very amusing, because there is no such state.
Exactly.
There's only continuous evolution, continuous involvement. Even, I mean, when you reach the level of no fear, that is only the starting point,
Yeah.
And also, when we talk about levels of consciousness, for example, okay, there's fear and there's love, but of course there are lots and lots of stages in between. But even when you get to a stage where there is, let's say, bliss. It's only one level of consciousness. From then on, there are progressively more levels to be realized, which we may not even have a concept of at our current state of evolution. So the whole thing is an ongoing process of evolution and development, and that's what is so fascinating about it and so
Yes.
beautiful.
Yeah, and evolution, if you just think about what is evolution, it's an open-ended process of change. And being open-ended means there is no done, there is no endpoint. As long as there are states that one can evolve into, as long as there's things to be, then evolution continues. And with all of the individuated units of consciousness, you and I and all the other humans and dogs and cats and bumblebees and everything that's here that's conscious, then there are so many possibilities that we have actualized but a bare scratch on the surface of the possibilities. So this idea that we'll run out of possibilities and be stuck is just maybe theoretically there, but I don't see it as a practical thing. And when you run into people that say they're done and this is my last incarnation and I'm not coming back here, that's ego talking.
Yeah.
Because love wouldn't say that. Love would say, wow, I've learned enough that I can really be more helpful now. And I want to engage. I want to be able to help people. Of course I'm coming back. As long as there's some way that I can be part of the solution here, I want to be part of that solution, because that's what love is all about. It's caring about other. It's not about yourself getting out of a challenging situation. It's about you embracing that challenging situation and doing the best you can with it and doing what you can to help other people evolve themselves as well. So yes, that done thing. I ran into several people who were claiming to be done, and I thought that needed a little clarification. It's a good way of making your congregation or whatever it is, your people feel better, because they feel like they've got a goal. They're going to get out of here. They won't have all the struggle and misery, but that's not the case. The struggle and misery is your challenge. That's what you grow up by doing. It's our choices that we make is the key thing here, not whether we're done or not.
I had a really interesting experience with regard to this. Some time ago, last year, I went with a friend of mine to Mount Athos. He suggested we should sort of see what these monks are up to on this island. And we had met some really interesting monks. One of them was a Buddhist who converted to Orthodox Christianity. So we had a couple of days talking about meditation and things like that. It was really interesting. And then at one stage he led us into a inner sanctuary of one of these chapels, because I said, what about these icons? Because I'm an artist, I'm rather interested in these icons these monks painted of their saints and things. And he said, yes, I can show you some. So he unlocked one of these inner sanctuaries, which are not normally accessible to tourists. And he lowered a chandelier in front of this icon. It was quite dark. He lit all the candles up. And before me was a very beautiful painting of a Catholic saint from the 4th century. And suddenly I had this overwhelming experience of presence. It was no longer a painting. It was like a physical being. And I was overwhelmed by this incredible love coming from this. My rational explanation immediately fell apart, and I just sort of surrendered to the experience. Now, the interesting thing was, the next day after I had this experience, I wanted to go back and re-experience it. So I sneaked around these monasteries. I was caught by one of the monks and told me I was not allowed in there. But then I persuaded him after I sort of was gesticulating, and I went back into the same room, and I meditated perhaps for about an hour, and then her presence was there again, totally. The only thing that was missing was the visual aspect of it, but the total feeling of a real person was there. And all she said very clearly was, there is no death. I am not dead. You know, the funny thing was, I came out of this experience and I told the abbot about what has happened there, you know, and he then gave me the whole story of this person's life and what happened to her. And then from then on, for the next few months, I only had to think of her, and it was almost as if she was standing next to me. So one day, and this is connecting to what you just said, Tom, one day I was meditating and I thought, okay, if she is such a saint, okay, maybe, because I had a little bit of a dry spell in terms of visiting higher dimensional levels and things, you know. I thought, if she's such a saint, I said, can you please show me your home where you live? Okay, so I closed my eyes and suddenly I was guided into this incredible dark slum. There was nothing but misery and poverty, you know, and sickness and things. And I said, hang on a minute, what is this? I said, take me to your home. And then she clearly said, my home is where I'm needed most. You know, and that's what you said earlier. You know, there's no end. You know, there's no doneness. You know, you carry on doing what you're meant to be doing. And this was a really powerful experience. And after that, of course, the sort of occasions, because I never considered myself to be a clairvoyant or a medium as such. I'm a little bit too practical in a way for that. And so the sort of dialogue finished after that, you know, but I learned a very important lesson, you know, from a person who has been dead for 1600 years.
Sure. That is the case. Consciousness is immortal. Consciousness doesn't die. Avatars die. You know, the body dies, but the body is not consciousness. Consciousness is the thing that makes the choices for the body. It's the being. But consciousness is immortal. It just evolves. I mean, evolution requires something to evolve, you know, and in this case, consciousness is the thing. It's, I guess, from our physical viewpoint, we call that spirit, but it's really what we are. Not a thing that lives in our body. It's a thing that we are. So it's, yeah, that's a very nice story. But we do, you know, the system finds ways to teach us what it is we need to know. And we have the experiences that we have because those are experiences that are helpful for us. And again, experiences we're ready for, that we can take that and make something out of it. We can learn something from it. We can do something with it. And that's why they're available to us. That's why we get those. If we weren't ready, some tourist comes in and looks at the picture and he'd just see a picture. That's all he would see. He wouldn't see anything particularly remarkable, just some old paintings. And he might think it's interesting from the perspective of the painting and the art and how it was done and the technique and all of that, but he would miss what was valuable from the larger reality sense, because he wouldn't be ready for that step. And if that happened, it would probably make him more fearful rather than more open. So you kind of have to wait for people who are ready. But when they are, the system wants us to succeed. It wants us to grow up. I mean, that's why we're here in this virtual reality, because it's kind of the fast track for growing up, because the choices we make here are very significant. Our choices we make here not only affect us, but they affect everybody around us. They are important choices, how we respond to things. And it's something that you need to work on for a lifetime. It's a lifetime's process. And the more you understand, the easier it is to understand more. the more your bigger your picture is, the easier it is for your picture to grow bigger yet. So it's just one of those things that, people who have made a lot of progress in a spiritual world will have all sorts of stories of the fantastic things that happened to them and what they learned from it. And the people who have not made any spiritual progress don't have any stories at all. All they know is the physical world, and nothing else seems reasonable or rational to them. Everything else is somebody's hallucination. But that's just the difference between people who are ready and growing, and the system is working with them to help them get forward, to help them grow. After all, we are part of that system. As we evolve, it evolves because we're just part of it. So it's a thing that the system wants us to succeed and is not hands off. The system gives us things as we need them and as we can use them. It's just, I've had that same sort of experience where I've been taken places, shown things, had experiences, and it wasn't because I knew about that. Just like you were taken to that slum and she says, I work, where I'm most needed. Well, that's a lesson. And I've been taken places and shown things many, many, many times for no other reason than to let me grow up some, to let me see something and understand the world, as a little better, a little bigger place than I thought it was. So,
but there's also another aspect to it, Tom, and I think one of the things which I became very aware of, that we are just at the moment at the beginning of expanding our horizon a bit. If you consider that only a few decades ago, the only knowledge we had about the afterlife was angels on clouds and devils in hell, And so I find, because more and more people are enabled to enter into these alternate realities or these expanded realities, we're actually getting also to know a little bit more about our home turf, if you like, which is not limited to the physical world around us. And I find that is a very, very important aspect. And to get to understand how we function on the subconscious level, and actually being able to see it, touch it, feel it, smell it, and that's really one thing which I found really fascinating, because we can actually visit our demons, confront them, and slay them. And so also in the process of which I sort of try to document in my books, the world around us becomes larger and larger. We understand more and more. We're getting deeper and deeper into the psychology of it, the mechanics of the human, being. But also, what I find interesting, that's why I'm so interested in what you're doing, I also find the physics of it rather fascinating. We get into a greater reality, and there are new physics at work, of which we had no idea they existed, and that I find absolutely fascinating. So my desire to report about it, I see myself as a reporter, really, traveling to certain places and just report. So the idea was that if many of us are able to do that, we will gradually find some sort of consensus and build up a picture of what is taking place. And perhaps if we approach this with a scientific mindset, we may be able to expand our tool set as well, and
absolutely.
And then for example, who knows, in a few years we may be able to find a kind of mobile device which allows us to make contact with people who have sort of gone there before us. It's just an idea, but I think it's not so far out of the impossible. I think that's a fascinating thing, and that's why I sometimes feel still quite excited when I have these experiences where I suddenly find, oh, this is how they work, this is what they do when that such and such thing happened. For example, I was mystified by, or let's say horrified by, the fact that people's belief systems can prompt them to commit heinous crimes. Like in the case of these ISIS people. So in one experiment, I was actually visiting the state of these people that they catapulted themselves in. And it was not just the state. I suddenly understood the mechanics of what was taking place, the interactions, the energies, what happened to the energies of the victim. How did that interact with the perpetrator? And suddenly you see a whole network of mechanics unfolding, and you think, oh, right, if this becomes available, if this kind of information becomes available to people on a wider scale, that will be a tremendous deterrent for crime, and things like that. So the education we're just starting is an ongoing thing, an expanding thing, and I hope that this reservoir will become more open, more accessible to many more people, and we will not so much act out of blindness, but more with a bit more awareness, with a bit more consideration. What do you think?
Well, yes, that's the general idea. The more that we know, the easier it is to know more. And that's true of us, the collective, as it is us, the individual. So as we grow up, as we, I call it, gain a larger decision space. We see we live in a larger reality. When we're just materialists, we live in a small reality. And as that reality gets bigger and bigger and expands, then the things that we can do also expands with it. The things that we are capable of, the degree to which we can be helpful, the service to which we can, provide, also expands and grows. And again, the more it grows, the easier it is to grow more. The more we grow up, the more other people grow up. The more they grow up, the more other people grow up. And it's just this positive thing. So, the more you can get people to see a bigger picture, just understand that we're all connected, that this is not A against B. It's A and B together, needing to learn to see the bigger picture so that they can optimize their existence together. You get that kind of an attitude, then everything will change. And it will snowball, because there is such a thing as collective consciousness. The more people become aware, then the easier it is for more people to become aware. So it does grow, and it does spread out until you get to a what do they call it, a critical mass, where if you get to a certain number of people that understand and have bigger pictures, then it starts to snowball. Then it starts to reinforce itself very quickly.
Yeah.
Now, we're not there yet. We're still struggling to get us to that critical mass. But at least there's a lot of movement now. There's probably more open-mindedness now than there was 20 years ago. You can see a kind of a movement where people are more open. Part of that is they used to know what they believed, and that was generally materialism. And then we got the internet, and the internet has so much information, so much good information, and so much nonsense, and so much bad information, that suddenly they didn't know what they believed anymore, which actually threw them into a place of being more open-minded than they were when they thought for sure they knew exactly the way the world is. So that's one of the effects of this internet, is that it's making people a little more open to possibilities, because they have seen that there's so much confusing data out there that you have to turn inside to be able to find what's helpful from what's not. You can't just get it from the outside, so the internet now is helping push people to this sense of being more open to possibilities, and that's good. So the technology helps, I think, more than it hurts. The technology also has its negative side, of course. We have all the conspiracy theories that are all about fear, 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 and fear, and that helps people be more fearful, not helps people grow up. But at the same time, it's broadening. It's, you know, we used to compare people who traveled a lot, and we said that they were sophisticated, and people who had never got more than 20 miles away from where they were born, and they were very provincial. And that sophisticated was much better because you had a bigger picture. Well, we want to do the same thing, but the traveling is not just in the physical reality. The traveling now has to be in a broader sense, and the traveling needs to see things from a broader picture. And that's the spiritual growth. And it's not so much, you know, there's a lot of paranormal things you can do when you understand the bigger picture. But the paranormal things themselves are really not insignificant. They're not important. There's no real value there other than in the process of interest in these things, people, whether they intend to or not, they start to grow up. So as you practice your out of body, you may just begin it thinking that, well, this would be neat. I'd like to go and see other places and other realities, and that may be your only motivation. But if you keep working at that, eventually you get a bigger picture, which leads to, you know, letting go of your self-centeredness so much. You're not so provincial. You have a larger understanding. Your ability to help grows, and pretty soon you're on a spiritual growth path that you never really intended to be on. You just wanted to go out of body, or you just wanted to heal, or you wanted to see auras or something. But as you do these things, they're natural growth paths to seeing bigger pictures and understanding. And though the phenomena are mostly useless in themselves, they are a good process of practicing getting in touch with your consciousness and getting in touch with the larger consciousness system and getting in touch with what's important and what's not. And it's part of a growing up process. So I kind of liken the paranormal phenomena as like the pretty flowers that are attractive.
The carrot.
The carrot right in front of the donkey, right? It's the thing that gets people interested and excited, but it's not really the point. None of that's particularly important, and people can grow up without ever doing anything paranormal. It's totally not required. It's not on everyone's path to growing up. It's irrelevant to growing up, but it does seem to put people in a process that as they pursue that process and get better and better at it, they naturally end up with bigger and bigger pictures, and those bigger pictures tend to grow them up. They tend to become more spiritual anyway, even if that's not what they were doing. And then eventually they get to the point that, paranormal phenomena, who cares? You know, that's not really very interesting. What's interesting is becoming love and caring and how can I serve, and all of that starts to come to the forefront. But it's just part of the path for many people in our culture, because our culture is a culture of doing, not a culture of being. They want to do things. Well, doing things that help them see bigger pictures are really good things for them to do on their path to growing up. So paranormal, yes, they're all there. They're part of being conscious, and they're all easy to do. They're not very hard. The fear is the thing. Fear, ego, and belief are the things that make them hard to do. And as you get rid of that, they're easy to do. But there's no particular reason to do them other than the growth that you get from the journey. I guess that's one way to put it. It's not the end point. Yes. It's the journey through these things, going maybe to them and then out the other side, that is really the significant part.
It's also a massive imperative now, isn't it, that we grow up because of what is taking place at the moment, where even our administrators are so confused that their own scientists totally fail to win them around, because they are so stuck in their 19th century belief, thinking that coal harvesting is better and making money than looking after our environment. So this sort of one-sidedness of false belief or illusion has reached a critical mass which can actually hurt us all. So we need to become aware. We need to become aware of the unity of our species, our planet, in order to survive, and that's, I think, on if there is such a thing as a sort of well, there is obviously such a thing as a greater consciousness system, which takes all this into account and is working from the inside gradually to create a sense of balance, But we also have to do our own work, We just have to be aware, become aware, and actually, as you said, we have to initiate love, which is the only creative power which vanquishes fear, but also has creative energy enough to actually make physical changes, which can start in our immediate environment, with our neighbors, our community. And that's how it spreads. That's what is needed.
I agree. Yeah. Well, we seem to be very similar, not only in the ways Donna mentioned, but we both seem to have white hair and white beards. And
Tom, I'd like to interject something, if I may. You all have been talking about purpose and about connecting and evolution and the larger consciousness system. And something Wيورغن mentioned earlier was that back in the early 1970s, he was a materialist, perhaps atheist. Now, you mentioned that also, and that your journey now, the journey into consciousness took you out of that, and your experiments are going to show that we have a purpose, that the purpose is to evolve and to grow, and that is the virtual reality concept that your experiments work on. Can you explain how you, Tom, grew from being a scientist that was atheist and materialist into discovering that virtual reality was the answer, and that how the experiments will also help prove that? I'm sorry, I'm not using the word prove. I will use the words provide evidence for.
That's much better. Yeah, we don't prove things. We provide evidence. People have to come to their own conclusions. Anyway, yes, my path forward was similar to Wيورغن's in some ways, but then different. Like I say, we all grow up in our own way, on our own path. And as long as you are open-minded and skeptical, you will end up at the right place eventually. That's the only thing you really need to be, is open-minded and skeptical. And if you are that, then eventually you will progress to head in a direction that is valuable to yourself and everybody else. So I started very, very young. When I was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, I was doing out-of-body. Entities came to me, taught me how to do out-of-body, and gave me a lot of lessons. And I went through training periods with them and so on. And then that door got slammed on that. And it was not to continue. And I was told that they did not want me to grow up being a weird child. And that was probably very wise of them, because we know what we do with weird children. We give them drugs. We cure them by giving them drugs and making their life miserable and making them outcasts and not part of our culture and so on. We put them in institutions sometimes. So that was a good idea, and it came back to me later. But like Wيورغن, I started with meditation. I was a graduate student in physics. Saw that meditation would help you get by with less sleep. That was my only interest in that at the time. And I did it and found out that I could find program errors in a meditative state that were more difficult to find if I actually had the programs, printouts in front of me. They were really hard to find. But in a altered state, boy, I could just pick them right out. Oh, there's one, and oh, I see that one. Yeah, and then I could go find my deck of cards and fix those things, and the program worked well. So that was when I went from materialist to being more open-minded. And Before that, yes, I was a materialist, and like all, I shouldn't say all, like most physicists, I had this idea that if you couldn't measure it, then it wasn't important or didn't exist. So you just throw anything out that you can't measure. So the measurable world is the only world that exists, and it's the only thing that's important, and everything else is a trick of the imagination, or something like that. So many scientists are in that boat, and I was in that boat as well. But then here I am using a meditation state to debug computer software, and it works. And it works a lot better than me trying to do it in the old physical way. So that opened up for me another whole sense of what reality was. All right, reality had this part that was objective, but it also had another part that wasn't objective, that was subjective. And once I understood that, being a scientist or being a physicist whose passion is to model reality, well, I had another whole part of reality I needed to understand. So then when I met Bob Monroe back in 1971 or so, 71, 72, then I was very anxious to work with him to see what I could learn. What could I learn about this subjective world that Bob had tapped into very much. So that was my beginning with out of body, and Bob was a good teacher, but I had actually done out of body, like I say, when I was a young child. So I learned very quickly. I was a very good student, and it didn't take long before I was able to go out of body whenever I wanted to, kind of on demand. And I did a lot of exploring. Matter of fact, that's what we were called. We were called explorers back in that time, and that was the idea. And we did a lot of evidential things, like we'd go in the booth. It's a soundproof booth. And the one booth that I got in was also electromagnetically shielded. It was a Faraday cage. And could we read numbers that Bob would write on a blackboard in another room after we were in there? And could we read headlines that were going to be on the newspaper, the local newspaper, a week from now? Could we, whatever? Could we heal? Could we talk to dead people? We just tried everything and tried to do things that were evidential. And eventually you get past the point of asking, is this real? You have had enough evidence, enough experiments with enough evidence that it's real. And the next thing is, well, how does it work? So I spend the next 35 years trying to figure out how does it work. And I could do that by doing research in the non-physical, in the sense that I would, remote view or heal or one of those things, and I would change variables. Well, we'll do it a little differently. What can I get? Where do I run into the wall? And why is that wall there? And why do I sometimes get it right and sometimes don't get it right? What's the difference? So I would keep working on that until I thought I understood it. Then I wrote the books, and the books, My Big Toe Trilogy, was really a theory of consciousness. But I knew from my work that consciousness was fundamental. Therefore, physics should have been a subset of consciousness. It's going to have to be derived from the thing that's fundamental. So I wanted to do that. And after the books were published, I got a couple of aha moments where I realized that the same concepts that I used to explain consciousness also explain physics. And suddenly I understood how quantum mechanics works, where before I was like all the rest of the scientists. I knew it worked, but I had no idea why particles should be probability distributions. I just know that if you use that math and you make that assumption, then you can compute the right answers. But why that assumption should be right, that was a big mystery, still is a big mystery. And then I started doing the other mystery, which was why should the speed of light be a constant? No matter how fast the source of that light's going, light just always goes the same speed. It's a constant. Only thing we know of that works like that. So it's something unique, something special. And why is it like that? And then with a little bit of thought, that came up. Oh yeah, of course, it's a virtual reality. You can only move one pixel, per 1 unit of time. And when that's as fast as anything can go. So that's the speed of light. So I got those sorts of things. And then I started looking at paradoxes in other fields, the paradoxes in physics. And I realized that with the same principles that describe consciousness, I could understand these paradoxes in science in general. But then I realized that the only way I would get other physicists to give it the time of day, even to look at it, even though it worked, was to do physics experiments, to do hard in the lab experiments that would produce evidence that this was a virtual reality and that consciousness was the computer. So I thought about that for 6 months or a year and came up with a set of experiments that I think will help do that. Now, I don't know for sure because being a scientist, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of myself primarily. I think yourself is the person you should be most skeptical of, and after that, you should be skeptical of everything else too. So we don't know how they will come out, but I think there's a good chance that they will come out and say something profound about the nature of our reality. And if that's the case, then that gives me some hard facts. Facts in the physics world are the results of experiments. Everything else is theory. Everything else is conjecture. Until an experiment's done, it's just conjecture. The experiments are what separate fact from fiction, fact from conjecture. Everything else is theory, if you will. Well, not even very well validated theory if you don't have any experiments. So these experiments speak facts to physicists, which is the only way forward as far as getting the physicists to open their minds a little bit and see a bigger picture. Now, they've had a lot of their own facts. There's a lot of physics experiments these days that show that materialism is just not right because materialism doesn't work. You can't get the right answers from a materialistic viewpoint. If you look at an electron as a little chunk of mass with a charge, you can't compute what's going to happen and what this electron is going to do. It just doesn't take you anywhere. But if you see the electron as a point with attributes of mass and charge, which is the way you simulate an electron, then you can compute the right answers and you can say what's going to happen in an experiment. So they know that the material viewpoint doesn't work. It isn't right. But they don't know what to do with that. You see, and they've been stymied with this for the last almost 100 years now, from the early 1915 up to 1925. Through that decade is when quantum mechanics evolved, because they had these experiments that were non-explainable by physical means. But they just didn't know what the next step was. Okay, how do we explain it? Well, after, particularly Einstein, the big gun, the guy who comes up with big ideas, he spent 25 years, the last years of his career, and came up empty. Couldn't come up with any really good ideas of what to do next. How do you deal with that? How do you understand it? So I found that the virtual reality concept provides all those answers. That is a perspective by which you can see things differently. And if you look at the world through this virtual reality perspective, you not only understand consciousness, but then you understand physics as well. And scientists have been going toward that perspective for the last couple of decades. So now there's probably 20-30% of the physicists in physics departments think that virtual reality is a good idea. But again, they're stuck there. Say, yeah, well, that's what our experiments say, but what do we do? What do we do with that? Where do we take that? What's the next thing? So I'm hoping my experiments will help them see that there is a next step, where they can get, if they take that perspective, if they understand really the concept of what virtual reality is, that they will start to see answers to all these paradoxes. And when they do, I think we'll have a revolution in physics. And when we have a revolution in physics, we will instantly, as a byproduct, have a revolution in philosophy and in metaphysics at the same time. Because as soon as the physicists, and I call them the high priests of Western culture, as soon as the physicists tell us that this is indeed a virtual reality, anybody with even a high school version of logic will then tell you, well, then where's the computer? Where's the programmer? If it's a virtual reality, it has to come from someplace. Virtual realities don't just pop out of nothing. They have to be computed. So that means that philosophically, metaphysically, what the scientists will be saying is that we are a subset of something that is non-physical from our perspective, and it's more fundamental than we are. That is the bottom line of them saying it's a virtual reality. And that's a huge step for people to take. Now, it's not an idea that's new. I mean, the Buddha said that this was he didn't use virtual reality. He said, this is Maya. This is an illusion. Well, virtual reality, illusion, that's all kind of the same thing. And the Buddha knew that love was the answer, and the Buddha knew that it had to do with, with growing up and lowering your entropy. He didn't use any of those metaphors, but basically a lot of it's the same. And so did many of the other religions, had the same kind of core ideas in it, but it's never actually gotten to the mainstream.
They never did the double slit experiment.
Yeah, that's right. See, it's never gone mainstream. But now when the high priests of science, the high priests of our culture, when they say this is a virtual reality, I think that is what it'll take to go mainstream. And I think meanwhile, until that happens, it probably won't be for several decades yet at the soonest. But meanwhile, there's people like Wيورغن and me and 10,000 other people that are stirring the pot saying, look, there's more to this life than just the physical world. Matter of fact, the physical world is the least interesting part, the least meaningful part. You need to see things through a bigger picture. And why does the bigger picture make sense? So with the thousands of us saying that, trying to introduce people to bigger ideas and bigger pictures, when the physicists a couple of decades from now really get to the point that saying this is a virtual reality, I think we're going to have a population that is, one, very fed up with the greed, the dysfunction, the self-centeredness, the meanness. We're going to have a population that knows that is not the best way, because they will have endured it for some decades to the point of being, fed up with it. And I think they will be ready for something more reasonable, for something that works better. And if we have a lot of people who understand reality is bigger than the physical, I don't know that it's going to be such a huge transition to take all of that with an internet that can spread it worldwide in, hours and days. I think we might have the first chance the human race has ever had of taking a giant step forward in this direction of becoming love, becoming more spiritual, seeing bigger pictures. And if we do, wow, that will be great for everybody. But in my viewpoint, the key to it, the key in unlocking that is to getting into the mainstream. And the key to getting into the mainstream is to get the high priests of science on your side. Because now the high priests are the ones that people listen to. The high priest says something's true, it's true. And that throws it into the mainstream. So that's kind of my view of hopefully the way things will work out over the next couple of decades, and that we do, for the first time, we not only have this internet that's helping people be open-minded, but it's also showing people how dysfunctional we are all over the world. That's becoming clearer too than just living in our own isolated communities. And it allows the solution to be spread and talked about and discussed worldwide rather than just in a little group of people who think they have a better idea, and not spread worldwide. So I don't think the humans have ever had an opportunity before to actually take, as a species, a giant leap forward. But I believe in the next couple of decades, we will have that option if we are primed to take it and do something with it. Because the downside is that when the physicists say this is a virtual reality, that's going to open up a big power vacuum, because now there's something more fundamental than us, and we're a subset of it, and there's going to be all kinds of people that are going to want to own that other, that non-physical thing. My God's a better programmer than your God. We're going to have a lot of struggle with people trying to step into that power center and take it over for themselves. Oh yeah, I speak for that larger thing that's making this virtual reality, and owning that then gives them power and prestige. And we need to avoid that pitfall. We need to bypass that, where people say, no, we've been there, done that. We don't want that. We all own that. We're a piece of that. And it's not going to be dictated to us. We have a bigger understanding. We can grow up ourselves. We don't need to be told what to do. And if we get there, and I think the way we're getting there is by the tens of thousands of people who are now trying to help people get a bigger picture. I mean, it's going on all over from all sorts of directions. There's Renaissance in most of the old mystical traditions, the Sufis, the Kabbalah, the dream, what do they call them? Not dream walkers, but dream something of the Aborigines in Australia. And a lot of these things are kind of making comebacks, looking at reality from a larger perspective. So all of this is seeping into our collective consciousness, trying to get us ready for this moment when we get to grow up en masse over a very short period of time. So I think that might be in our future, and maybe after by the end of this century, we might even have completed, like the first step of that process. So I'm very positive about what's going on and where it's going. But I think the route has to go through physics. Now, I'm a physicist, so and I do simulations. So maybe it's the case of a hammer seeing everything else as a nail, but that's the way I see it as far as where we have to go, because it's been done before. I mean, people have understood these things. A lot of these mystical schools, they've had pieces of the big picture. Sometimes they had a lot of dogma and nonsense too, but they've had pieces of the big picture. They've been around for a long time. It's not that what Jürgen and I are saying is new and nobody's ever thought of it before. It's just now we're putting it into a context that it makes sense to people today, and we can go forward with it in the mainstream. That will be the best of all possible worlds, if that works. And I see it as a possibility. So that's kind of where I came from, and I went through, a lot of growing. When I started with Bob Monroe, it was like, I want to learn how to do this out of body, because I want to prove to myself it's real and it's not just imagination. And until I experience it, it's not my truth. It's just somebody else, and it's always going to be my skeptical side will always put that off at hand's reach. But if it's my experience, now I will be able to tell whether it's true or not. So that was my idea coming in. And like you, I read some Eastern philosophy to try to make sense of it, see what other people, what they thought and how they figured it out. I read Seth Speaks, and see what Seth had to say about the nature of reality. And all of these were kind of inputs to me, but none of them seemed to explain everything. Most of them seemed to explain bits and pieces. So my job was to bring it together in one big understanding.
Yeah, you have to go there yourself, don't you? I always find when I open a book, after I read a few paragraphs or a few pages, I thought, no, I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. So I immediately go into meditation, and it's all there. And when you hear it directly, when you see it directly, it has got much greater impact, than when you read it through other people's work,
Right.
And I think it's just a shift in the kind of focus we need to accomplish in order to look inside, because all the information is already laid out. We just need to find our access route to it, and then whatever happens, because we're all individuals, the growth of the planet can happen exponentially, because we all use our individual tool set to make things work and work together, and that's why I see it very positively too, because there's so much potential at the moment.
Yes, there is. But a person has to want to do it. The only person you can change is yourself. Other than that, you can help provide an environment in which it's easier for people to change themselves, but you can't make anybody change themselves. So we have to get to the point where people see the possibilities and want to grow up, want to actualize those possibilities. And they know they have to do that by changing themselves. If just that idea comes across, then we'll have 90%, of what we need. If we just get that idea, because most people, they're just here doing what they need to do. They're mainly driven by pain and ego and fear, and they're just getting by, trying to make it through life, they don't have this sense of being self-centered, or it's about carrying other people. They're just trying to keep number one and number one's friends and family, you know, all going along in a positive direction. So we need a bigger picture, and I think that'll come. I believe that bigger picture will be launched when the physicists say this is a virtual reality, because that instantly forces a bigger picture on everyone, the philosophers and metaphysics people and everything. See, there's your bigger picture. Reality's virtual. It means it's computed. It has to come from someplace else, and that someplace else has to be non-physical to us, because you can't compute the virtual reality of yourself. You know, virtual reality doesn't compute itself. It has to be computed somewhere else, and that somewhere else has to be non-physical to us. You know, and we can see that in our virtual reality games. We can see that's just a basic fundamental nature of the way virtual reality is. And after that, then we have to come up with this other reality that's non-physical. And of course, consciousness is the only thing that really fits that bill. It's the only thing that makes good sense, that consciousness is an information system and this is a simulation. Well, information systems make simulations. You know, that's a perfect fit, hand in glove there. So I think that we'll get there, and I'm hoping it'll be sooner instead of later.
Yeah.
But who knows?
I would like to comment to Jürgen that we appreciate his expertise in consciousness, all of the documentation that he's done of his experiments and experiences. Tom has recently organized CUSAC, which is the Center for the Unification of Science and Consciousness. And I think we want individuals such as yourself who have had decades of experience in consciousness to be connected with that, and the organizations that have done decades of experience in consciousness. We appreciate all of your work, and we are delighted that such a respected consciousness researcher can contribute towards the goal that Tom has set for CUSAC, uniting science and consciousness, his experience, your research. So
Donna, I agree with all of that, but I would like to remove myself from the center of it.
Okay.
I'm just another contributor. I'm not at the center of any of that. I'm another contributor. And like I say, 10,000 others are all solving this problem. And you need 10,000 others, because everyone is going to do it in their own metaphors, in their own way, and those metaphors will apply to a certain set of people. And if you try to force it all down into one metaphor, like the MBT metaphor, you're going to miss a huge number of people. You need to have it said in 1,000 different ways, with 1,000 different sets of metaphors, all moving in the same direction. Well, it needs to be a group thing. There can't be any one dominant center to it, or you're almost starting another religion, and that's not where we want to go.
No, it's just that your center wants to acknowledge all of the people in the individuals. True. And I think we were talking earlier about differing viewpoints are necessary, because it is the nature of our reality to be, it's subjective. So we are living in a subjective reality. So naturally, we all have different experiences. However, the thing that we must do, that we must connect with and interact with, is that long-term goal of love. People just naturally live in their own worlds, and I think this is where a lot of our conflict comes from. So we are trying to, acknowledge that we are in subjective realities, that we all have different viewpoints. However, we have a single purpose, and I think that is what your organization really stands for. Not that it's particularly just your viewpoint, but getting all of the organizations who have done so much research, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, Pear Labs, and countless others, the Rhine Research Institute in Duke, all of them, and individuals such as Jürgen, have contributed so much to the just preponderance of evidence towards consciousness being the root of reality. So that's kind of where I was going with that. So
yeah, those are the basic ideas. That I guess the basic idea is that love is the answer. Love is what we need to evolve between, and love is really about cooperating and caring about other. And if we get that across, then you don't need to get anything else across. That is the whole thing. But it'll be, if we can get that across, it won't be because a few people created those ideas. It's going to be because thousands and thousands of people understand that is a better way to approach life, is with love and caring and cooperation, and that leads to a better reality than self-centered, don't care, it's all about me and mine, and that leads to dysfunction. And if we get that idea across, we are mostly home free. But that's a tough thing to sell to a bunch of materialists. But I think we sell it in lots of ways, through lots of channels, through lots of diversity of people and ideas.
Tom, I'm very fond of your idea of virtual reality, because as a computer artist, I'm working on virtual reality programs or apps in order to transmit an experience or an inner experience which hopefully will trigger a higher set of experiences in people. So the whole field of virtual reality is actually very, very beautiful. You can do new things in it, and you can exploit it in order to use it as an engine to drive consciousness to new perceptions.
Absolutely.
So that's what I'm working on at the moment with a friend of mine who is a musician, who is providing the sound, which is taken from mantras and chanting, and and so I think there's a lot of potential using your virtual reality for the benefit of others.
Yes, and the kids coming up these days don't find virtual reality a difficult concept. When you talk to people who are my age, virtual reality is a real hard thing for them to get their mind around. They just have a hard time thinking that this physical world is computed. It seems impossible. But when you talk to kids who've been playing virtual reality games since they were, 6 years old, they kind of look at it and go, yeah, sure, that makes sense, because they've had the experience. And if you do what you're doing, which is combine that virtual reality with things that actually help you see bigger pictures, that kind of reflect, the virtual reality reflects kind of a larger reality that you live in. And then, that's all win, win, win. But I think we're coming to where there's going to be so much of that, because it's so productive. It works so well that people are not only going to be using virtual reality for amusement and for entertainment, they're going to be using it to help themselves grow up, to help themselves learn how to do things, to help themselves, whatever, be more what they want to be. The virtual reality concept is a very powerful concept because it puts you in a very specific learning space. Just like the people who are going to fly airplanes, but the airplane costs, $20 million, and you don't want to put a new guy who's never flown one before in the cockpit, so you put him in a flight trainer. And they fly airplanes in a flight trainer with a computer for a long time before they ever get behind that $20 million airplane and fly it. So it's a tool for learning, and that's a very technical aspect as a flight trainer, but it can also be a spiritual aspect. It can be an understanding aspect. It can be a social aspect. It can be, how do I interact with people, and what kind of feedback do I get from that interaction? Well, what's better than a virtual reality? Kids are playing Sims and Sim Tower and all this stuff, and they're learning a lot of things by opening themselves up into these experience sets where they're making choices within these rule sets. And all of that is very helpful, but we've just scratched the surface of that. There's so much more we can do with it. So many other things it can be applied to. I think in a decade, virtual reality will be really, really common. And we will have begun to harness it and put it to use for learning, for growing, all sorts of ways. So I think the argument that I make now is a very, very hard sell to many people. But in another decade, it'll be, sure, virtual reality. Yeah, this could be a virtual reality, because they will have spent time enough in virtual realities that they know it's a place where you make choices. Not a matter of reality. It's a matter of choice making, and how valuable is it?
Yeah. Tom, I think we only just scratched the surface, really, because next time I see you in January, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the other points we haven't really had time to address, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, I expect that we could probably sit around and talk for probably several days and not run out of interesting things to say.
I would love that to happen, but I know your time is a little bit limited. One thing I would like to mention, though, is that we have another person who's done experiments and things. Our own Oliver Weiss has produced a documentary called Seeing Without Eyes. Now, it's produced in German, and I won't try to pronounce it, Sehen ohne Augen, German with English subtitles. And what he has done is he's filmed and interviewed children and tested them. So there's the experiment part. They have learned the psiability of seeing without eyes using a special mask. We will have this documentary, Seeing Without Eyes, up on Tom's YouTube channel soon, and I think you'll find it very interesting. But this is getting to the root of when you experiment with children, they're so open and they're so naturally inclined to these sorts of things. So I think it's a wonderful experiment, and Oliver did a wonderful job on this documentary.
Yes, after you posted the clip, Donna, I contacted the lady in England who runs these children's groups, and I asked her whether she will train teachers. So she wrote back to me and she said she's going to start a teacher training program next year. And I think I want to see what this is all about. So I want to enroll on her program.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. That's one thing that Tom's wife, Pamela, had asked about. She's interested in that too. And I think beginning with the children and teaching a teacher's course would be fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a fascinating discussion. And thank you, Oliver, for providing the server here. And Jürgen and Tom, we will see you in the UK in January.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Jürgen.
Tom, see you in a few weeks.
Yeah, see you in a few weeks.
Okay, take care.